This is a response video to Forever James. His video is entitled Reading the Right Volume 1, The Bell Curve. One of my viewers left a comment asking me if I'd watched his video and what I thought about it. I then remembered that I had watched part of the video a while back, but I believe when he got to the part where he characterized Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, as having ruined hereditarianism for a generation, I turned it off. So, after receiving that comment and having a bit of back and forth, I decided to make this video. This video is for you, Bluebird. I will say that, in contrast to some others I see on YouTube out there, it does appear that James actually read the book, or at least he was able to characterize the outline of it somewhat competently. However, he does state some things that directly contradict what the author said in the book, so I'm not confident that he read it that thoroughly or carefully. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to play an hour-long video and respond to everything point by point, so I'm going to take on the actual claims he makes. But before getting into the response, I'll try to summarize his video. James introduces the video in the context of Charles Murray being shouted down at Middlebury College. This is one of the things I agree with him on, that it's a bad idea to shut people out of debate even if you think their ideas are dangerous. The idiom, sunlight is the best disinfectant, would apply here. He makes the rather bold claim that the Bell Curve is, quote, the most insidious book of the 20th century, unquote, even noting the competition of, say, the Turner Diaries or Mein Kampf. James then talks about the genesis of the book. He notes that the Bell Curve would probably be more associated with Richard Herrnstein than with Charles Murray if Herrnstein had not died just a month before the book was released. Herrnstein had written books on this topic before. What made the Bell Curve different was the potential policy implications of this data, which was more within Charles Murray's line of work. On more than one occasion, I've heard critics complain that Murray is just a social scientist. He has a PhD in political science from MIT. Apparently, these people are unaware that Herrnstein was a Harvard psychology professor, which is about the highest credentials you could possibly ask for when discussing the field of intelligence research. James then summarizes the four main sections of the book. He makes quite a few errors here and some misrepresentations, but actually does a better job than your average progressive YouTuber in giving a basic outline. As you might expect, he places more emphasis on the racial differences than is warranted, and intersperses a lot of assumptions about the author's motives, during which he takes the least charitable interpretation possible. Even though the video is roughly divided into a summary, and then, quote, the takedown, he engages in plenty of attacks during this section. For the takedown section, he first goes into a deconstruction of the concept of race, more variation within than between, you know the drill. He then goes into Lewontin's arguments, such as height being highly genetic but also susceptible to environment, as is the case of South Koreans being several inches taller than North Koreans, on average. The idea here is that even for a trait which is highly heritable, substantial differences can exist between groups for reasons that are purely environmental. He then goes into four main categories of attack for which he believes discredits the Bell Curve. First is what he calls the black box, which is mostly composed of arguments from Richard Nisbett. Second is the Flynn effect, which is the secular increase in IQ scores over time and the implications for the nature versus nurture debate. James does a fairly good job explaining this and Flynn's theories on why this occurs. Third, he discusses lead poisoning and seems to think lead is the key variable in the black-white IQ gap. Fourth, he talks about policy implications should the Bell Curve be accepted as valid. This is mostly framed as how the information could be used to justify cutting social programs and then use the extra money for tax cuts for the rich. He then has what seems to be a fifth section, which he combines with a fourth for some reason, to talk about the Pioneer Fund, Mankind Quarterly, and how these organizations and research they funded contributed to the sources of the Bell Curve. The whole video has a very politically tribal vibe to it. At one point, James says, "I want to face our enemies." I don't think you're an enemy, you're just wrong. That's all. I should mention that there's been some excellent comments in response to this video, particularly from this account Science and Race, which I will be occasionally referencing. With that said, let's get into the video. About 5 minutes in, James claims that Richard Herrnstein was outside the mainstream in intelligence research in the 1990s.
The Bell Curve wasn't really supposed to be Murray's book. It was pitched as being the definitive work of Harvard professor Richard Herrnstein, who focused most of his career on the nature of human intelligence. Herrnstein was something of a bit of a dinosaur in human intelligence circles, even back in 1984. He was a big team nature guy on all of the nature versus nurture debates going on in academia.
The idea that intelligence is heritable is incredibly mainstream. This will be the first of many times that I cite the American Psychological Association's Task Force report, Intelligence Knowns and Unknowns. According to this report, which was specifically drafted to provide a mainstream assessment of the science presented in the Bell Curve, states that the low-end estimate based off quantitative genetics is that IQ is 50% heritable. The high-end estimates are closer to 75%. An additional source I will use to demonstrate that Herrnstein was well within the mainstream in 1994 is the book The IQ Controversy, Media and Public Policy by Mark Snyderman and Stanley Rothman. This book came out only 6 years before the bell curve, so I think it serves as an excellent benchmark to assess whether the content in the bell curve is within the mainstream. This book was written in part to establish what was actually mainstream in regards to everything related to IQ in the 1980s. In this book, the authors sent out just over 1,000 questionnaires to a carefully selected set of academics and researchers as shown here. Of these, they received 661 responses, the credentials of which are summarized in this table. For instance, 53% were university faculty and 55% currently conducted research into intelligence. So, not cranks by any stretch of the imagination. As for the heritability of IQ among white Americans, the mean response from these experts is 0.6. So what this means is that 60% of the variation in IQ among white Americans can be attributed to genetic variation. And they gave an almost identical assessment to the heritability of IQ among black Americans. Now, if you want to define Team Nature as someone who's a proponent of genetic differences explaining the racial IQ gaps, that is of course a more contentious subject. However, we have a question that addresses the mainstream opinion on this as well. Question number 18 in this survey was worded as follows. Which of the following best characterizes your opinion on the heritability of the black-white difference in IQ? The plurality view at 45% was that the difference is a product of both genetic and environmental variation. 15% believed the difference to be entirely environmental, 24% thought there was insufficient data to support any reasonable opinion, 14% did not respond, and 1% believe the difference is entirely due to genes. These survey results align almost perfectly with the perspective presented in the bell curve. Herrnstein and Murray stated that the within-group heritability of IQ among white Americans is no less than 40% and no more than 80%, so they split the difference and assumed 60% for their book, exactly the mean response from the survey. As to the source of the black-white IQ gap, Herrnstein and Murray simply said that it is likely that both genes and environment are involved, but as to the proportion of one versus the other, there is not enough evidence to justify an estimate. James also claims that Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, destroyed the Team Nature position for a generation.
The publication of Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man in 1981 basically ruined Team Nature for a generation of academic acceptance, leaving Herrnstein on the outside of his own field in his own era.
The Mismeasure of Man did no such thing. It was widely criticized in actual intelligence journals. What The Mismeasure of Man did do, however, is influence the opinion of non-specialists and the general public. This book did not address hardly any contemporary researchers, instead attacking mostly 19th century and early 20th century scientists. Just consider the cast of characters that Gould attacks in this book and when they were active in their research. So we have Samuel George Morton, 1830s and 1840s, Paul Broca, 1850 through 1880, Henry Goddard, 1910s, Alfred Binet, 1900s, Lewis Terman, 1910s through 1930s, Charles Spearman, 1900s through 1930s, Robert Yerkes, 1910s, Cyril Burt, well, he had a long career, but consider he was born in 1883 and retired in 1951. This isn't a comprehensive list, but if you flip through the table of contents, that covers 80 to 90% of the main figures discussed in the book. It is implied that their supposed mistakes and fallacies, which are highly debatable in terms of what the book alleges, can be used to dismiss subsequent and even modern-day work in the same field. One of the few, or perhaps only, researcher he attacked that was contemporary in 1981 when the book was first published is Arthur Jensen. However, pretty much everything he said about Jensen can be easily seen as misleading or completely wrong by reading Jensen's own review of The Mismeasure of Man and reading Jensen's work itself. I think the single best line I've read that summarizes this book is from Jensen himself. Quote, "Readers expecting to find a forthright critique of the present status of issues and controversies in these fields are in for a disappointment. The closest thing they will find to criticism of contemporary mental testing is the insinuation of its guilt through remote historic lineage." I'm sure at some point you'll get to Gould's review of the bell curve, which I've thoroughly responded to in this video. Stephen Jay Gould is wrong about the bell curve. James also makes some claims about the G factor.
Number 1. There is a G factor. The G factor is a concept first established by Charles Spearman at the turn of the century that there is a general factor of cognitive ability. Basically, smart people are smart generally. This theory has been hotly debated over the last 100 years, with the general consensus in 1994 mostly falling on the G factor's side. But by no means is this, or was it, wholly accepted. It's even more hotly rejected today. The G factor is now considered an older tool for understanding human intelligence. A statistician's tool, not a biologist's tool. And not a very useful tool, really, in any regard.
The G factor is just as well established today as it has ever been. Of course, there are some researchers that contest its validity, but with neither of us being true experts in the field, I can only point to mainstream consensus. The Wikipedia article isn't a bad place to start. It actually offers a fair summary of the topic. Although James does recognize that in 1994 the consensus was on the side of G, I still think it's worth reviewing the Snyderman and Rothman survey results on this. Is intelligence as measured by intelligence tests better described in terms of a primary general intelligence factor and subsidiary group of special ability factors, or entirely in terms of separate faculties? This is basically asking whether they think the G factor exists or not. 58% responded that they favored some sort of general intelligence construct, 13% thought separate faculties were more valid, 16% said they did not favor one or the other, and 14% didn't respond to that question in particular. So in other words, of the people that actually had an opinion, 82% believe the general intelligence factor to be a valid construct. If you're really going to make the claim that the G factor isn't a valid construct today, then you'll need to contend with this book, Human Cognitive Abilities, a Survey of Factor Analytic Studies by John Carroll. Carroll concludes that the G factor accounts for about 50% of the common factor variance in a typical IQ test. This means that there are other factors that explain individual performance on IQ tests, verbal, visual, spatial, etc., but the G factor, or general intelligence, has as much or more explanatory power as all the other factors put together. If you think Gould put the G factor in its place, check out my video on the subject. Stephen Jay Gould is wrong about the G factor. The too long didn't watch, Gould's view on G hasn't had any scholarly standing since at least the 1950s. In order to justify his position, he had to completely misrepresent the second order or hierarchical version of G, which is the modern predominant framework in which to represent the factorial nature of IQ. James also implies that IQ tests are racially biased.
Number 5. Properly administered IQ tests were not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups. This assumption is just the most dubious sounding sentence, which brings us to the core problem of this book.
The easy response to this is, even Stephen Jay Gould doesn't think the tests are biased. Read his review of the bell curve. Quote, "All of these authors swear up and down, and I agree with them completely, that the tests are not biased in the statistician's definition. Lack of S-bias means that the same score, when it is achieved by members of different groups, predicts the same thing, that is, a black person and a white person with identical scores will have the same probabilities of doing anything that IQ is supposed to predict," unquote. Gould then goes on to talk about how perhaps society treats minorities unfairly, and that's why they score lower. This is a hypothesis that could be examined, but how again does that mean that the tests themselves are biased? He doesn't even really make a case for it. The long answer is, this topic has been studied to death, and the penultimate treatment of this topic is Bias in Mental Testing by Arthur Jensen. This near 800-page beast of a book is significantly harder reading than the bell curve. The preface begins as follows. Many widely used standardized tests of mental ability consistently show sizable differences in the average scores obtained by various native-born racial and social subpopulations in the United States. Anyone who would claim that such tests are therefore culturally biased will henceforth have this book to contend with. I'm sure at this point, if James is watching this, he's probably snickering that I would even bring up such a supposedly debunked and discredited researcher such as Jensen. Well, laugh while you can, because you won't be at the end of my section on Jensen and James Flynn. James then talks about the heritability of IQ directly.
Number 6. Cognitive ability is substantially heritable. Apparently no less than 40, but no more than 80%. Basically, you're as smart as your parents.
Mostly.
And that cognitive ability will be passed down to your kids.
Mostly.
A genetic heritage that is, once birthed, immutable and inescapable. Since, as you can tell from reading the book, that Murray and Herrnstein are more 80%ers than 40%ers, to them, you are basically all you are going to be, from the formation of your brain in the womb.
Mostly.
And yes, this is one of those statements that sounds so idiotic that you're almost driven to believe it, because what else but compelling evidence would ever drive someone to say something like it?
Again, according to the American Psychological Association, IQ is around 0.75 heritable. The Snyderman and Rothman survey of experts in the mid-80s said it's 0.6 heritable on average. According to the APA, IQ is incredibly stable by age 6. You can probably find stuff that attacks and attempts to deconstruct the evidence for both of these claims, but this is the APA. How much more of a mainstream source could you ask for? Even if you take the lowest estimates of 0.5 or even 0.4, the bell curve's main thesis remains intact. James then characterizes Herrnstein and Murray's position as considering your IQ to be equivalent to your value to society, and says that they are IQ absolutists.
In part 2, entitled Cognitive Classes and Social Behavior, the authors take all of this one step further. IQ is not just an accurate predictor of job performance and academic success in life. It is an accurate measure of your value to a society as well. It becomes clear that Herrnstein and Murray are IQ absolutists, believing that this number determines all of our life choices.
Let's see what Herrnstein and Murray actually say about this. From the very introduction to Section 2, where they present all of their data for the association of IQ and socioeconomic status with socioeconomic outcomes, they state the following. For virtually all the topics we will be discussing, cognitive ability accounts for only small to middling proportions of the variation among people. It almost always explains less than 20% of the variance, to use the statistician's term, usually less than 10% and often less than 5%. What this means in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score, a point that we have made in part 1 and will make again for it needs repeating. On the other hand, despite the low association at the individual level, large differences in social behavior separate groups of people when the groups differ intellectually on the average. They make it quite clear that IQ on the individual level is not at all deterministic, but if you take groups of people with differing IQ distributions, you can be much more confident in predictions. Herrnstein and Murray make that point contrasting what you can say about two 11-year-olds, one with an IQ of 90 and the other with 110, versus two 6th grade classes, one with an average IQ of 90 and the other with an average of 110. At the individual level, you can't say much, but with large groups of people, you can make very reliable predictions. Let's take a look at another quote from the bell curve. This one is relevant to the characterization James makes about the authors believing that your IQ is equivalent to your value to society. Measures of intelligence have reliable statistical relationships with important social phenomena, but they are a limited tool for deciding what to make of any given individual. Repeat it we must, for one of the problems of writing about intelligence is how to remind readers often enough how little an IQ score tells you about whether the human being next to you is someone whom you will admire or cherish. The thing we know is IQ is important, but not a synonym for human excellence. James then characterizes the bell curve as claiming that IQ is tied to lineage.
Let's remember that intelligence is hereditary,
Mostly.
and immutable. The NLSY shows that the poor performance and intelligence are not tied to environment or even life opportunities, those first few chapters of any biography you read. Success is tied to lineage, tied to just the first line of that biography, the line that states that you were born and to whom you were born.
Herrnstein and Murray don't claim this, nor would any hereditarian really say this. Yes, they will say intelligence is 50 to 80% heritable. However, there is a statistical effect that works against you known as regression to the mean. The easiest way to explain this is with a simple example. If two white people with an IQ of 130 have children, the average IQ of their offspring will be about 115, halfway between their IQ and the population average. Even really smart and high-achieving people will tend to have children that are more average on the whole, statistically speaking. The converse is also true. Less intelligent people's children will tend to score higher than they do, on average. James then brings up the supposedly racist researchers referenced and cited in the bell curve.
But make no mistake, viewers, I have actually read this book. This is not the end of his assessment of this data. He very much is on the side of the heredity of intellect, using studies by psychometricians such as Arthur Jensen, Travis Osborne, Richard Lynn, Linda Gottfredson, and J. Philippe Rushton, all of which we will talk about later.
James goes into greater detail later in the video, however I might as well address it now. For the most part, he only attacks Philippe Rushton, Arthur Jensen, and Richard Lynn. Since this video is only about the bell curve, I'm only going to discuss these researchers to the extent that they are referenced in the book specifically. So let's start with Philippe Rushton. First, I'd like to point out that Rushton, by far the easiest of these to attack, isn't even mentioned in the bell curve until Appendix 5. So claiming or insinuating that Rushton provides any substantial source material for the bell curve is just wrong on its face. I'm not heavily invested in defending Rushton, but I think some context is warranted. The first thing to mention is that Herrnstein and Murray don't weigh in on the veracity of Rushton's conclusions. Quote, "We cannot at present say who is more nearly right on the matter of science, Rushton or his critics." The reason for mentioning Rushton at all I think is understandable. Suppose that there is a genotypic or genetic-based difference in IQ potentials across populations. If that were true, what else would you expect to find? If this difference is real and genetically based, it would seem to be a consequence of divergent evolution in humans. According to Wikipedia, Homo sapiens appeared around 300,000 years ago and first left Africa 70,000 years ago. By the way, when I reference Wikipedia, I'm not using it as an authoritative source. I'm using it as a baseline, reasonably conservative, non-controversial source. Not only is 70,000 years a significant proportion of the history of our species, but those populations that left Africa apparently interbred with Neanderthal and Denisovans. So if you're non-African, you have between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. If you're an Australian Aboriginal or other certain populations in Southeast Asia, you also have between 3 to 6% Denisovan, according to Wikipedia. Anyway, if you believe his data, I'm not going to adjudicate it here, Rushton found many variables that show an East Asian to European to African continuum, from pregnancy length, maturation of the infant at birth, age at which adolescents reach puberty, twinning rates, age of first sexual intercourse, just to name a few. And yes, he found differences in brain size, which have been replicated with MRI studies. James also uses Rushton to guilt by association debunk Jensen. I actually find it kind of humorous that this is the second video I've run across that attacks Jensen with the same three-step process. Number 1, Philippe Rushton is supposedly obsessed with racial penis size, especially of blacks. Number 2, Jensen co-authored papers with Rushton. So number 3, Jensen is wrong or something. And also Jensen has been discredited and debunked without specifying a single instance of said debunking. This is some real NPC tier argumentation here. As for Richard Lynn, as far as I can tell, the extent to which Richard Lynn is referenced has to do with the IQ of East Asians and Sub-Saharan Africans. The bell curve doesn't take a strong position on East Asian IQ, saying that if they had to assign a number to it, it's 3 points above the white average. They state that there's stronger evidence for the non-verbal versus verbal IQ discrepancy than there is for the full-scale Asian versus white difference. James Flynn, James' self-described hero of the story, actually agrees with this. Refer to Flynn's 1991 book about Asian Americans. He concludes that East Asians have the same non-verbal intelligence as whites and slightly lower verbal intelligence. So in this sense, Flynn is more of a white supremacist than Herrnstein or Murray. The main thrust of the book is that Asian achievement in the United States is far above what their IQ scores would suggest. However, I think it's interesting that even Flynn agrees with the nonverbal versus verbal IQ differential. As for the Sub-Saharan African IQ, several studies by Richard Lynn are cited. However, far from dwelling on this research, the bell curve devotes about 1 page to this in total. The only number they cite is from Lynn's 1991 paper that reviews 11 studies and comes up with a median African IQ of 75. Earlier work from Lynn placed the average slightly below 70. His most recent work places it at 71. Now, from my perspective, if you're criticizing Herrnstein and Murray for referencing Lynn, I would expect you to name an alternative source they should have used instead, and what number they would have come up with for an average African IQ. Whatever you think of Lynn, he happens to be the researcher that has done the most work in this area. As far as I can tell, the only major critic that criticizes both Lynn on technical grounds and comes up with an alternate figure is this guy, Jelt Wichertz. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And he didn't really arrive on the scene with this stuff until 2008-2009. So you can't really fault Herrnstein and Murray for not mentioning him. However, even adding his critiques doesn't change the story all that much. Wichertz and his co-authors had several back-and-forth exchanges with Lynn and his co-authors. Wichertz criticized Lynn for not conducting their literature review in a systematic way and that they didn't really present clear criteria for which studies to include or exclude. Lynn responded that several of the studies he chose to exclude, which Wichertz chose to include, were elite samples that were highly unrepresentative, and so on. The bottom line is that Lynn's overall data suggests 74 or so. Lynn thinks the best estimate is 71. Wichertz, depending on the paper, estimates somewhere between 77 and 82. To me, it seems that Wichertz wants to exclude studies with populations that have clear problems: malnutrition, people with HIV or malaria, or people that had no formal education. Lynn wants to include these studies because those conditions do in fact represent real and widespread environmental influences in Africa. But here's the most interesting part, in my opinion. In Lynn's latest book, he estimates that the genotypic IQ of sub-Saharan Africans is about 80, meaning if an average African was raised in an environment typical of a first world country, they would develop an IQ of 80. So how much do Lynn and his most significant critic really disagree here? In terms of what the current day IQ average is in Africa, not much. They're just mainly quibbling over which IQ studies to include. And lest you think that Wichertz is some sort of racist as well, although he comes up with these low numbers of between 77 and 82 that you might think is subjectively low, he also thinks that the Flynn effect has yet to take hold in Africa, which could result in similar IQ increases as have been seen in first world countries. He also believes that the psychometric validity of IQ testing in Africa is questionable, based on using multi-group confirmatory factor analysis to test for factor invariance between Africans and first world populations. What this means is that something even as seemingly culture fair as Raven's progressive matrices may still be biased, according to his analysis. So anyway, if you're going to take the environmental position on IQ differences here, you should really be thanking Richard Lynn and his low IQ estimates in Africa. Consider the difference in environment between sub-Saharan Africa and the average African American. According to the World Bank, the gross national income per capita in sub-Saharan Africa is about $1,500, about $4 per day. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2016, the median African American household income was about $36,000 per year. Just that disparity alone is significant, not to mention the differential access to medical care, education, and the prevalence of parasites such as malaria and HIV levels present in Africa. If you really believe all that is worth only 5 IQ points, what chance do you have in explaining the 15-point gap between blacks and whites in America today? So finally, let's discuss Arthur Jensen. Later in the video, James claims that Jensen was a punching bag for Stephen Jay Gould and James Flynn.
One of the main scientists cited heavily in the bell curve was a towering figure of modern psychometricians, Cal Berkeley's professor Arthur Jensen, who received $1.1 million of funding from the Pioneer Fund and is one of the most debunked and criticized proponents of the gene theory of intelligence. He was a favorite punching bag of both James Flynn and Stephen Jay Gould.
Gould certainly tries to make Arthur Jensen a punching bag, but fails in my opinion. I plan to make a video about this, I'm sure you can guess the title. But as for James Flynn, just no. This one brief comment exemplifies more than anything how James doesn't understand what's going on here at all. This is especially noteworthy considering his characterization of Flynn being the hero of the story. The fact is that Flynn and Jensen were completely cordial in their interactions both in publications and at conferences. They had a tremendous degree of mutual respect and they were in frequent contact with each other for over 30 years. To help Flynn prepare for his first book on this topic, Race, IQ, and Jensen, Jensen sent Flynn preprint chapter summaries of his book Bias and Mental Testing. Jensen was the entire reason Flynn became interested in making IQ the focus of his academic life. This was no doubt due to Jensen's 1969 article in the Harvard Educational Review titled with the question, "How much can we boost IQ and scholastic achievement?" The answer, which is a 120-page journal article, more like a small book really, is there doesn't seem to be much we can do to boost IQ in a systematic way, and the reason for this might be genetic in origin. This caused quite a similar reaction to the bell curve in 1994. I would say this article actually caused a greater media firestorm than the bell curve did. Jensen went from being a totally unknown academic at the University of Berkeley, California, to requiring bodyguards with him at all times on campus. Anyway, in Flynn's 1980 book titled Race, IQ, and Jensen, he attempts to make the case that the environmental position is viable, in contradiction to the evidence that Jensen cites. However, before going into his case at all, he spends nearly 50 pages defending Jensen from his contemporary critics on the technical issues specifically. He does this in part to steelman his intellectual opponent, but also to emphasize that Jensen's arguments are serious and need to be taken seriously if a coherent environmental position can still be credibly maintained. To quote Flynn, "At the very least, we can say that Jensen's work landed like a bombshell in the midst of the environmentalist camp. Most of us, particularly those in social sciences, had come to look upon an environmentalist hypothesis about the IQ gap between black and white as being virtually self-evident, with only the triumphant accumulation of more and more evidence in its favor to come. By simply demanding actually to see some evidence and subjecting it to the most minimal criteria one would normally see in the social sciences, Jensen showed that many of the most cherished environmental hypotheses were sheer speculation without one piece of coherent research in their favor." Here's some more Flynn quotes to clarify this matter. "I have no sympathy, to put it mildly, for those who've attempted to deny Jensen an opportunity to present his views, those who have called him a racist or racist ideologue, and those who have questioned his professional competence or ethics." So James, your self-proclaimed hero of the story, James Flynn, has no sympathy for you. But let's continue. Concerning Jensen's professional competence, he strikes one as a professional surrounded by amateurs. Concerning his professional ethics, he is scrupulous in his attitude towards evidence, even bringing forward evidence he knows to be antagonistic to his own position, a habit not as common among social scientists as one might desire. Flynn also dedicated his 2012 book, Are We Getting Smarter? Rising IQ in the 21st Century, to Jensen. To Arthur Jensen, whose integrity never failed. Jensen passed away in 2012, but that dedication was written before his death, not after. And finally, after Jensen's death, Flynn wrote a eulogy in the journal Intelligence. To quote Flynn, Although I met Arthur Jensen only 3 times, I feel that I have lost a colleague that I respected and liked and whom I saw daily. There was no such contact, of course, but his ideas were always in my mind, and for over 30 years we had a dialogue that dominated much of my scholarly research. I will say something about his character which has been much maligned. He was without racial bias. He took it for granted that all human beings should be judged on their merits as individuals, and could not understand how others might misuse his research to do otherwise. He was unprepared for the storm of abuse that greeted his conclusion that the black-white IQ gap had a significant genetic component. So James, if you're going to call Jensen a crank and that he's been debunked, you're going to need to do 2 things. Show some debunking that Jensen hasn't comprehensively responded to. Obviously anything after his death in 2012 doesn't count. And number 2, square that notion of him being debunked with Flynn's repeated and emphatic public defense of Jensen. At one point in this video, James implies that when the bell curve talks about poor Americans, it's really just code for blacks.
At about this time in the book, the authors get oddly obsessed with birth rates of the poor. I feel comfortable using quotation marks around the term poor now, since we know who they're really talking about.
I can't read the mind of the authors, but I think it's worth pointing out that according to the 2014 US Census, 10% of non-Hispanic whites live in poverty as compared to 28.3% of blacks. Also, according to the census, there are 328 million Americans, 63% of which are non-Hispanic white, and about 13% of which are black. So, doing some simple math, there are 20.6 million whites living in poverty and 12.1 million blacks. As much as James wants to make this book about race, it just isn't the case. Race plays an element for sure, but not nearly as much as he hypes it up to be. James then talks about some of Richard Lewontin's arguments about human genetic diversity and mentions the same seeds, different soil argument.
What is race? Well, when you look at it from a genetic level, which we can do now since Murray and Herrnstein published the book, the picture is now even clearer. The science is conclusive that genetic variation within racial groups are greater than those variations between these racial groups. Think about that. I can say it again if I have to. The science is conclusive that genetic variation within racial groups are greater than those variations between them. Black people have less in common with other black people than they do with white people. Of course we know this. We know that if we take seeds from a particular hardy crop and grow them in differing soils, we get differing yields, genes, and environment, right? And who can fucking tell which is really which?
I'm not going to take a super hard line on this topic, but I would like to point out what I would consider to be compelling criticisms of this line of reasoning. For instance, this guy Edwards authored a highly cited paper titled Human Genetic Diversity, Lewontin's Fallacy. To understand Edwards' argument, you first need to know what Lewontin was technically claiming. Lewontin was using a metric known as a fixation index, or FST value, which is the averaged increased probability that a random gene will be different across the entire species rather than in a given subpopulation. Lewontin comes up with a figure indicating that 85% of the genetic variation in humans is within populations, and only 6% could be accounted for by racial classification. Edwards' main point is that even taking the 6% figure at face value, subsequent research has found it to be closer to 12%, is that the average probability of having a different gene variant, also known as an allele, is not of great importance, but rather the correlation among these alleles. Different human populations will tend to have clusters of alleles. Just taking the superficial differences in West Africans versus Europeans, West Africans will tend to have alleles producing darker skin, curly black hair, higher muscle mass, fast twitch muscle fibers, and so on, that all tend to go together in a basket of traits. These different populations can be distinguished using this information by genetic cluster analysis. There are numerous papers in the literature showing that using a sufficient number of gene loci, self-identified race matches with best fit genetic cluster at an extremely high success rate. If you use just one loci, you'll misclassify somebody based on self-identified race at something like 30% of the time. As you use more and more loci, this misclassification rate approaches 0. I'll link to some of these papers in the description. I'm not making an argument for any specific taxonomic classification of race or anything, but it's undeniable that different geographically separated populations on Earth can be distinguished in this way just by looking at their genome, specifically correlations of allele frequencies. As to the different seeds and different soils point, such as the differential in height of North Koreans versus South Koreans, this is absolutely true. But applying that to human differences, such as blacks versus whites in America, is presupposing some unknown factor that almost exclusively affects blacks and not whites. I'm not saying that's impossible. I know James thinks that lead is most likely the answer, But here's what the hero of James's own story, James Flynn, has to say about that. Far too many of Jensen's critics have not taken up the challenge to refute him in any serious way, rather they have elected for various forms of escape, the most popular of which has been to seize on an argument put forward by the distinguished Harvard geneticist Richard C. Lewontin. I see nothing in Lewontin's example to encourage optimism. We environmentalists have always known that we had to find environmental factors that handicap blacks. To be told that these factors must be uniform within black and white, like a nutrient artificially doled out during a controlled scientific experiment, is not much help. James then mentions some stuff about Murray admitting environment matters or something, and that making this point belies the entire point of the book.
Genes and environment, right? And who can fucking tell which is really which? Murray's going to say that he makes this point in this book, but I think making the point belies the entire rationale for the book.
The hereditarian position on IQ is that in the range of environments in the first world, variation in IQ is somewhere between 50 and 80% due to genes. Nobody is saying environment doesn't matter. James then brings up some studies that fail to find a correlation between racial admixture and IQ.
For instance, blackness as a race is indicated to be of inferior intellect. So let's make a hypothesis based on the bell curve's conclusions. Blackness is negatively tied to intellect, so since races can and have been mixed, the level of blackness in a person would correspond with cognitive ability, making a gradient scale of IQ scores, with the blackest individuals having the lowest IQs and the whitest having the highest. This makes rational sense, right? Well, that doesn't happen. Since 1966, we have known that IQ does not correspond to skin color at all.
The data on this is mixed, actually. The Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study found intermediate IQs for kids with one black and one white parent. More on this later. James then brings up the IFIRTH study.
Outside of the seedy origin of the circumstances of this study, it is a commonly understood fact that many children born in post-World War II Germany were fathered by American soldiers. Some were black and some were white, obviously. A scientist by the name of Efforth did a 1961 study of several hundred black children left behind to be raised in German society. Their average IQ was identical to those white children left behind to be raised in Germany. This does not point to a correlation to genetic blackness and low IQ either.
Yes, this study does seem like evidence you could point to in order to argue that blacks and whites have equal genotypic intelligence and is mentioned as such in the bell curve. However, this study has several problems that I think are strong caveats and should be understood before drawing strong conclusions. So number 1, the IQs of the mothers and fathers are unknown. Number 2, the population of African American fathers is skewed towards the higher end of the IQ distribution, since approximately 30% of blacks failed the military entrance exam as opposed to 3% of whites. Number 3, 20 to 25% of the black fathers are not sub-Saharan Africans, but rather North Africans in the French military. North Africans are known to score higher on IQ tests than sub-Saharans on average. Number 4, the children were all tested before adolescence. Although IQ tends to be fairly stable by age 6, IQ becomes much more heritable with age as well. So when you're only testing children, this has the potential to mask genetic influences. I'm not saying the study is totally invalid or should be disregarded, but given the problems, you'd need similar studies that replicate the results to have a compelling case. James then claims that there exist only 2 studies that back up Herrnstein and Murray, then also claims that several of the studies he listed were not mentioned in the bell curve at all.
There are only 2 real studies of black children divorced from typical black environments that support Herrnstein and Murray's thesis. One is a bullshit study that is now believed to have been totally faked, and the second is a study so uncontrolled that the authors themselves cautioned against using its findings. Murray and Herrnstein choose to excuse the first study's clear fabrication and use the second study to extrapolate greatly from it. None of these other studies were mentioned in the book at all, because the bell curve is not a serious book of study.
As to Cyril Burt, this is wrong on 2 levels. His work had nothing to do with black children. It had to do with using English twins reared apart to estimate the heritability of IQ. And also, it is far from the only study of twins, and if Burt did indeed fake his data, which is very much in dispute contrary to what you may have heard, he somehow came up with a figure that comports with most modern studies of twins reared apart. I don't know why James would say this study was used to justify anything about the black-white IQ gap. At most, studies like this show that IQ is highly heritable in first world countries. That of course leads to the conclusion that the black-white IQ gap could be plausibly due to genes, but it certainly isn't proof. Also, the Minnesota twin study has nothing to do with, quote, black children divorced from black environments. Perhaps you're thinking of the Minnesota transracial adoption study. This study was a hard pill to swallow for the environmental case because it started off very hopeful when the testing was done at age 7, but the follow-up at age 17 wasn't looking so good. This could be predicted by what is known as the Wilson effect, where IQ becomes more heritable with age. IQ appears to be very malleable in children, but as they age into adolescence, genetic effects seem to dominate. Also, contrary to your claim, Herrnstein and Murray did mention some of the studies that indicate no genotypic IQ gap between blacks and whites. They explicitly cover the Eifert study of German children, see page 310. They also reference the 1997 Sandra Scar paper that shows no difference in black IQ versus various ways to estimate the proportion of white ancestry. Next, James brings up the work of James Flynn and William Dickens that show a narrowing of the black-white IQ gap of about 3 to 6 points between 1970 and the early 2000s.
But unfortunately, the data didn't stop in 1994. A 2006 study by Flynn showed that the gap between American whites and American blacks had closed up to 6 points between 1972 and 2002. That's more than a third of the 15-point IQ gap between blacks and whites.
There's two things to say about this. First is that there are many standardization samples that do not show this narrowing of the black-white IQ gap. Dickens and Flynn found there was with the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Stanford-Binet, and the Armed Forces Qualification Test. In 2 papers from Charles Murray, he showed that the Woodcock-Johnson standardizations did not show this trend, nor did the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth for the Peabody Test Battery. This trend is also not observed from achievement tests such as the SAT, ACT, GRE, and so on. With the SAT, we have massive sample sizes and it correlates with IQ tests at greater than 0.85. If there were a declining gap, it should show up on the SAT. Second is that Flynn and Dickens' data does not say what you probably think it says. What many people seem to think is that the black IQ increased from 85 to 88 or 90. According to their model, based off the 4 standardizations they analyzed, they still end up with an average black IQ at age 24 of 83.5 as of 2002. So there was a gain of 4.5 points there. Their model indicates the age 24 IQ in 1972 was 79. If this surprises you, look at this chart from Flynn's paper. Recall that the black-white IQ gap increases with age. Since the white average is always set at 100, this makes it appear as if the black IQ keeps dropping. While the Flynn-Dickens data does show lower IQ score gaps for children, we're still looking at an adult black IQ of 85 or even slightly less. Part of what complicates this discussion is that the IQ gaps change according to age. I don't know about you, but I think the IQ scores that really matter are for adults. Scores for children can indicate overall trends and especially indicate changes in childhood environment, but adult IQ is what really matters. James mentions that Murray departs from what Rushton and Jensen are saying on this topic. That is partly true. As far as I can tell, Flynn and Dickens think the IQ gap declined from 1972 to 2002, and they think the earlier data has too many problems, so it's hard to say what the gap was in the past. Jensen and Rushton think the IQ gap has always been about 1.2 to 1.1 standard deviations, so about a black IQ of 82 to 83 from World War I to the modern day, which was the mid-2000s when all these discussions were occurring. But more importantly, in terms of what this discussion means for the future, is that Murray does agree with Jensen and Rushton that the IQ gap hasn't closed since the mid-1980s. Murray thinks it was 1.1 to 1.2 standard deviations in the past, and then it declined to about 1 standard deviation by the 1970s, then remained stable since the 1980s. I think Murray's conclusions make the most sense taking all available data into consideration. James then criticizes Flynn's criticism of black culture.
I shouldn't gloss over some of the more problematic elements of Flynn's thoughts. He is a civil rights activist and a democratic socialist, which automatically makes him like my second favorite James. But he has harsh opinions on black culture that he says sets the disadvantageous environment for intelligent offspring. He's especially hard on American black culture. He has done many studies showing that blacks raised in adopted white homes and blacks raised in other modern cultures, such as in Germany, have much higher IQs and experience more success than those raised in American black homes. Though clearly sympathetic to the ongoing fight for civil rights in America, he is a bit of a pull up your pants and stop listening to that hip-hop kind of guy. And if that bothers you, and it should, that is an element of his work with which you will have to grapple.
The stuff about criticizing Flynn for criticizing black culture kinda pisses me off. If Flynn ends up being right, and I haven't personally ruled that out yet, don't you think black culture, particularly young male black culture, might have something to do with this? From 70% of black boys being raised without fathers to the whole notion of engaging in intellectual endeavors as acting white and on and on. Part of what pisses me off is that I actually like Flynn. Among the environmentalist crowd, he's by far the most intellectually honest one, and has done the most original work to bolster his case. You should only be so lucky to have a guy like this, so quit complaining. James then brings up the well-established fact that the black-white IQ gap increases with age.
One last thing before we leave Flynn. He notices one interesting point about black IQ that I think is worth mentioning. When given rudimentary standardized tests, white and black babies have equal IQ scores. At the age of 4, there is a 4.5-point difference. Then, from the ages of 5 to 25, blacks lose 6/10 of an IQ point a year. Why could that be? Why could it change as you age?
He views the IQ gap as being initially equal, but then black IQ falling with respect to whites. This is partly what leads James to bring lead into the story, which we'll get to in a moment. As I discussed a few minutes back, it appears the black IQ is falling only because the gap is widening and the white IQ is always set to 100. Note that an equally valid way to interpret this data is that white IQ increases faster in relation to black IQ with age. If blacks do indeed have a lower genotypic IQ, again, this evidence is well explained by the Wilson effect, where IQ increases in heritability with age. In young children, environment is much more important, but by the end of high school, IQ is perhaps 60% heritable, and by middle age, as much as 80% heritable. Very young children with roughly equal environments will have roughly equal IQ, but as they age, genetics starts to increasingly assert itself. The Wilson effect perfectly explains what is known as the fade-out problem as well. This occurs when children are placed into enriching environments at a young age, such as in Head Start or in adoption studies. As in the Minnesota transracial adoption study, all children scored quite well at age 7, but then when they were retested at age 17, the average scores were very close to the mean of the population they came from. This is a reason why you should never trust an IQ intervention or adoption study or really anything regarding IQ in children unless there is a follow-up in late adolescence or adulthood. The heritability of IQ is lower in children, so whatever heritable difference there is could be suppressed. James then presents what he believes to be the root cause of the black-white IQ gap: lead.
Part 3. Are blacks being poisoned? Yes. Yes, they are, and we have known about it for decades. Let's talk about lead. Lead poisoning has 2 types of toxicity: acute poisoning, throwing up and diarrhea and shit, and the more pernicious, chronic poisoning. We're only talking about the chronic poisoning of lead right now, specifically childhood exposure. It is well known that lead exposure lowers cognitive ability, IQ, and it increases erratic, violent behavior. IQ lowers as childhood lead exposure rises. It is as close to a 1-to-1 correlation as you can get. But no one made this connection during the bell curve debates. That is until 2012, when our second hero, anti-lead crusader Rick Nevin, decided to address it in his amazing paper called Lead Poisoning and the Bell Curve. It really should be the absolute end of any debate about Murray and Herrnstein's book. African Americans, regardless of socioeconomic class or income, were more prone in the 20th century to have higher blood lead levels based on their propensity to live in older homes in urban areas, regardless of class, while even the poorer whites of that time period still tended to be raised in the newer, less polluted suburbs.
James, I'm sorry to say, if the black-white IQ gap is indeed environmental, lead is not going to get you there. Now, I will say that the evidence that Rick Nevin presents looks somewhat convincing at first glance, such as in 1988 to 1991, 18% of blacks had levels above 10 micrograms per deciliter, or something only like 5% of whites do. This, taken together with the cited 7.4 IQ point drop for an increase from 1 to 10 micrograms per deciliter and stopping the analysis there, seems compelling. However, there are several problems here. Even if we take only the data that James presents here, and for the purpose of argument, assume the black-white IQ gap is close to 10 points, which it hasn't, you still need to show an average blood lead level difference of at least 20 micrograms per deciliter. I say at least because as blood lead levels increase, you have diminishing returns in terms of IQ impairment. According to this chart, you lose 10 points by going from 0 to 20 micrograms. To lose another 5 points, you have to go all the way up to 40 micrograms. So even taking the absurd position that whites have 0 lead, You need to show that blacks have, on average, 20 micrograms per deciliter just to explain a 10-point difference. Fortunately, we do have data on average differences in blood lead levels with a nationally representative sample. The oldest of such data available is from the CDC going back to 1991, which shows the largest black-white difference on record. The difference varies by age group, but for the important 1 to 5-year-old range, the difference is about 2 micrograms, an order of magnitude lower than what you need to even get this argument off the ground. A difference of 2 micrograms gets you a difference of about 2 IQ points at the very most. Now, suppose the data prior to 1991 had dramatically higher racial gaps for lead. If that were true, you would expect to see a dramatic narrowing of the IQ gap for people born in the late 80s or early 90s. In other words, you might see evidence of rising IQ for blacks taking standardized tests in the 2005 to 2009 range, but you don't. What's more is if we use data other than what James presents, the case gets even worse. The data that Nevin uses is from one study done in 2003. They had a somewhat small sample of about 100 children to estimate the effect of going from a baseline blood lead level of 1 microgram per deciliter up to 10 micrograms per deciliter. For this difference, they cite an IQ point drop of 7.4 points. This study from 2005 meta-analyzed 7 studies, including the one that Nevin cites, and came up with a model showing the following. An increase from about 2 micrograms per deciliter to 10 micrograms per deciliter showed a decline of 3.9 points. Going from 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter, a further decline of 1.9 points, and going from 20 to 30 micrograms per deciliter, a decline of only 1.1 point. So going from a relatively normal range of 2.4 micrograms all the way up to 30 micrograms per deciliter, the model predicts a total loss of less than 7 points. Taking this model and all available racial differences in lead levels on record explains less than 1 IQ point. And one final thing to say on lead here, if you think lead is such a magic bullet, don't you find it odd that people like Flynn, Nesbitt, and Turkheimer don't really have much to say about it? At the most, they include it in a laundry list of environmental effects, including prenatal drug use, lower rates of breastfeeding, and so on. If you don't see any of the most committed environmentalists emphasizing lead to this degree, that might be a clue that you're on the wrong track here. This is not to say that I don't think lead is important at all. It's possible that the reduction in lead over time contributed to the Flynn effect, and that the lower racial gaps in lead exposure we see today could have contributed to the closing of the black-white IQ gap we saw prior to the 1980s. So in closing, the bell curve was presenting the mainstream science on this topic back in 1994. The authors were fairly conservative in their statements, so nothing they said has been overturned in the last 25 years. The positions that James takes seems to be a mixture of Stephen Jay Gould mixed with the kind of stuff you'd see from left-wing journalists, mixed with a bit of Richard Nesbitt. If I were you, James, I would actually read some of James Flynn's books and papers. You'll come away with a much more balanced view of this topic. However, the downside is, once you gain a more nuanced and balanced view and realize there are smart and intellectually honest people on both sides of this debate, it makes it much more difficult to create entertaining videos that pander to an ideologically entrenched audience.